This presentation is designed to help you think about what you need to include in your data presentation and analysis, and it includes some examples of pieces of work just to help inspire you and think about what you might include. I've included the mark scheme just to begin with, just to have a look at what the requirements are. If we look first at the data presentation section, which is worth 10 marks altogether, you need to make sure you're using a wide-ranging and accurate use of different techniques, and you need to make sure that they're well selected, so they're appropriate for the type of data that you're presenting. On the other side of your analysis and interpretation, to get to the top mark band there where it says 15 marks, you need to make sure that your analysis is sophisticated, it's very clear, and it's really appropriate to the question that you are addressing. I like to think about the analysis as a describe and explain question in an exam. So you'll be presenting your data, you'll be creating almost like a figure like you might see in an exam, and then you'll be describing exactly what it shows you, and then also explaining why you think it is like that. So you'll be explaining why the data you've found is how it is. And within that, you might start linking that to wider aspects of geography. So you need to make sure not only does it link to your study, but also, why is what you're finding important in relation to other aspects of geography. Your data and your analysis section should be dealing directly with your sub-questions. So you need to make sure that when you are creating a graph or a chart or a map, or if you're putting some rephotography together, you've always got to think about which sub-question is this going to help me answer. If you can effectively present data and analyze each of your sub-questions, it's going to go a long way to helping you answer your. So let's have a look at some techniques that people have used in the past. And to begin with, all the data that you've collected, you're going to need to collate it in order to be able to draw graphs with it. Raw data tables should not be included in your data presentation section. So you can see here this is a table of EQS results, and really this shouldn't be in your NEA. You will need to create it in order to draw graphs from it, but it shouldn't be put into the main body of your data presentation section. So you can draw tables like this and do it in Microsoft Excel. It's quite good for collecting data and putting it together, and then from that you could draw graphs. And you need to think about what type of graph would best represent this particular data, so the EQS data. This student has decided to do their EQS data comparison as a radar diagram, which is a really nice technique for comparing areas of different data. This investigation was looking into comparing some of the different docks across Liverpool, and you can see here that they've got the different colours, and you can really clearly see the three locations and what sort of environmental score they've got. And I quite like the way that you can see the footprint of them depending on how good or bad each of the areas were rated. Do notice that the student here has put a figure for each of the different data presentation techniques they've used, and these should run throughout your NEA. So your very first map that you put in your introduction should be figure 1, and as you move through you're obviously building up. So just keep that figure system going, because it's useful when you need to refer to them in your written work. The next piece of data here is being represented in a bar graph, which is really simple. Please just make sure that any graphs you are drawing have their axes labelled. So here you've got distance travelled to Albert Dock. Up the side you've got the amount of people, and you can see it's got a very clear title labelled on it. So just make sure they're already clear and labelled on, and again you can see the figure here and a description of what that each of the figures shows, so make sure that it's really clear. Here the student has looked at house prices in the Albert Dock, and they've looked at that over time, and so they decided to use a line graph for that, which again is an appropriate technique because it shows change over time. Graphs don't always have to be done on the computer. This student was doing an investigation into a woodland ecosystem, and they thought it would be easier to draw the graphs by hand, and you can see the data that they've got on. So they've got the height above sea level in meters, and they've done a transect at 5 different sites to show where those sites are, and then they're labeling on the different trees that they found at each of the different sites, the main key species. So, it doesn't have to be done on a computer. You can draw it by hand. It can be equally effective. This graph here was from investigation into peatlands, and they were looking at footpath erosion, and so they've done a cross-section across a path, and they've showed the depth eroded by depth across the path eroded in centimetres, which again is a nice way of visually representing how it's shown. Just be careful with the axes. You can see here the student struggled a little bit. So they've got 0 here and then -10 at the top. Depth eroded in centimetres. It just got to be careful with Excel. Sometimes you can get a little bit confused with the way you're inputting data, so just make sure it's always nice and clear. So we move on to different techniques now. Here you've got photographs, which is a really easy way. This is rephotography. You can see again, you've got the old photograph next to the new photograph, which has been and date on it showing when they were both taken. So make sure that it's nice and clear which photograph's which. I always think it's quite nice to add annotations onto photos, but you do have to make sure it doesn't get too cluttered. This student here has looked at photos changing over time. Google Maps is quite a good way to do this. If you go onto Street View, you can actually change the date that the photographs were taken, so you can scroll through time, so you can get a bit of a change. And you can see here these 3 photographs, actually the area has significantly changed over time. The student here started to analyse it a little bit and give a description next to it, and I think that this is really effective with photographs in terms of, they always say a picture tells 1,000 words, but you do need to put some words next to it to explain what these photographs are showing you and make sure they're really clear. Whether that's annotations or whether that's a description, some written words next to it is always good explanation. Here's a word cloud, which is always a nice way of representing either interviews or questionnaires if you've asked people what they think about an area. This is really nice that the student has actually annotated the word cloud just to start explaining a little bit. And this would be a form of analysis. You can see the student started to bring analysis into it, so explaining why some of the words, they think some of these words came up. With cartographic techniques, make sure all maps have a north arrow and a scale, which is what this student has not done. Cartographic techniques are useful for showing locations of where you have done things, so where you've collected data. So this student here has shown where they collected their data in their EQS data in the Albert Dock. So they've marked on their different sites just to show where they were, which is quite a nice way of doing it. Also, cartographic techniques can be analysis of secondary data. So this map here shows the spread of Asian Pakistanis in Sheffield, and they would have gone on and analysed that map as part of their work. You can see, I think here, this map starts to get a little bit messy. I can't see what that ethnicity table says. The north arrow and the scale just look a bit messy, and the areas marked on the map. Do try and keep maps as clear as possible, and just be careful when you're including them to make sure that they're really clear and you can see what they're trying to show. Again, this student here has done a map of footfall, so they've shown how many people were found in each area, and it's just quite a nice way of, it's very simple, it's not overly complicated, just adding on a little symbol onto a map to show how many people were in each area. It just gives us a nice visual representation of where that is. If you're going to access maps, sometimes it can be very difficult to find good base maps, and Google Maps can be a little bit crowded, so when you go on it, it's got loads of information all over it. If you go to Ordnance Survey Maps online, I'll actually show you on here. If you zoom in, you can see on here that this is Sheffield, you can actually see that one of the things I like about it is you get the outline of the buildings. So if you were to do some sort of land use map, you can really see the outline of the building. So these maps are quite stripped back, so they're a bit more effective because you can really see particular building shapes and road shapes, so that's quite useful. You've also got the login from the Field Study Centre from the ArcGIS, and on there are quite good base maps as well that you can use. So if you're not sure what the login is for that, speak to me or Miss Glue and we can give you the data, give you the information you can log on to use that. Your data presentation and analysis goes side by side. So although they're separate on the mark scheme, you are almost doing them one after the other. So after you've created a piece of data presentation and you put it underneath the sub-question that you think it's relevant to, you will be analysing at the side of it, so the two sections go with one another. For each sub-question, you need to have maybe 2-3 pieces of data presentation, and all of these should have analysis alongside them. You need to do it one sub-question at a time. So you're going to put sub-question 1 as a little subheading, and then you actually write your sub-question out, and then you'll put your first piece of graphical information and you'll give it a title saying figure 1, pie chart showing respondents from a questionnaire, whatever that questionnaire question may have been, and then you'll write about what that shows you next to it. Then you'll present your next graph, so it might be a line graph showing changes in house prices, and then you will analyse that graph by the side of it. As I said earlier, and I think this is really important, your analysis needs to explain what the presented data shows you and then discuss how it's relevant to the question and start to think about the links to wider geographical ideas. Imagine it like a describe and explain question in an exam. So you get the piece of graphical information, you describe what it shows you, picking out key trends, using data, and then you explain why you think it's like that. And this is going to link back to theories or models or articles that you've read. I'm not going to read each of these individual ones out, but you might want to pause them and just have a read of them. They're all good examples of ways in which students have analysed their work. So you've already seen this graph today, already in this presentation, and this here then starts to show what their analysis is. Again, this relates to the graph on housing prices, and you can read the students' analysis and you can see how they're starting to link it to wider ideas of geography. They're going into detail on how it might link to the way that the economy in the local area has changed. This is from the peat study, so looking at peat depth on Kinder Scout. Again, I'll encourage you to pause this and have a read of what it shows. And then finally, this just shows you, this is back to the Albert Dock study, and it shows you how the student is trying to incorporate some geographical theory and models into this. In this case, they're using the Clark-Fisher model, and they're using it to explain how Liverpool has moved from a pre-industrial to an industrial to a post-industrial economy, probably more focused on industrial and post-industrial. Obviously, northern cities were affected quite badly by deindustrialization, and Liverpool's Albert Dock is a really good example of how Liverpool has moved to a post-industrial economy. So good luck with your data presentation and analysis, and make sure you email and ask us if you have any questions.